Well, kia ora, and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be there with you in person. My life just seems to be dominated with Zoom meetings, so I was really looking forward to some in-person time. I watched the YouTube recording of yesterday's speakers, and hopefully this talk can follow up some of the ideas that were expressed yesterday. So my talk traverses two notions. One is conservation, and the other is Te Mauri or Te Taiao. Both are steeped in societal and cultural values, but they are not the same. One notion has dominated how nature has been treated here in Aotearoa and in other parts of the world, and the other has struggled to be recognised. One is part of the machinery of colonisation to express authority over both people and nature, and the other is part of the Māori worldview, to live within and alongside nature in a respectful way, acknowledging the Māori or life force of all things, animate and inanimate. We have lived with a certain way of conceptualising conservation since settlers arrived, and many of those values and assumptions went on to underpin New Zealand laws, regulations, policies and practices, including the Conservation Act. Passed in 1987, this Act has remained unchanged. And 34 years later, we have all the evidence we need to conclude that this approach to conserving and preserving nature, particularly indigenous flora and fauna, simply hasn't worked and isn't fit for the scale of threats to biodiversity and issues and aspirations we are facing now as we move towards a more sophisticated Te Tiriti or Waitangi nation and society. So in the year 2000, I received a telephone call that would change my life. No, I didn't win lotto. I'm still waiting for that. But I was asked to consider putting my name forward for appointment to the Governing Council of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, with special responsibilities for Indigenous peoples globally. I knew a little bit about IUCN, but I knew a lot about conflicts between Indigenous peoples and conservation groups throughout the world, because these have been and continue to be a consistent negative experience for Indigenous peoples, a clash of values about caring for nature. And it's really quite ironic when you think about it. I decided to proceed with the nomination and subsequently was appointed to council for a 4-year term, followed by another 4-year term, followed by election as chair of one of IUCN's 6 scientific and technical commissions, the Commission on Environment, Economic and Social Policy, and then followed by re-election for a 2nd term as commission chair and 4th term on council. So that's 16 years in what became a continuous deep dive learning into the history, values, practices, policies of conservation, and the move to acknowledge what hasn't worked and why, innovate and design new approaches and standards, and recognise the vital role that Indigenous peoples have in safeguarding the environment and offering solutions that have yet to be tried beyond our cultures. These photos are not as random as they might appear. They represent some of the meetings where significant turning points occurred in global conservation policies, and I'll speak a little more about these soon. So one of the highlights during my time with IUCN and as chair of CEAS was being able to convene in my hometown, Whakatane, a global conference, Sharing Power, named after the publication of the same name by leading Commission thinkers. Speakers included Ojibwe activist Winona LaDuke and Nobel laureate Eleanor Ostrom, which you see here in this photo. And it was at this meeting that a major shift occurred within IUCN in terms of acceptance that conservation not only needs social sciences, but that good conservation requires applied and social sciences to work together and alongside Indigenous knowledge and sciences. We took Eleanor to Te Urewera, hosted by Tame Iti. This was before Te Urewera was returned to Tūhoe. Ostrom's 8 design principles for managing the commons are often cited in New Zealand papers, and I think she'd turn in her grave if she read how her work is sometimes being quite perversely interpreted. Ostrom's principles, like the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, are a total package of which governance in nested tiers from local level to the entire interconnected system is a central tenet. So as time is of the essence, these are just a selection of some of the shifts and innovations that occurred during my time with IUCN. I've already spoke of the shift of recognition that conservation is also a social science. This was a major intellectual change for IUCN, which is a science-based organization, and it used to be quite sort of snobbish of the real science and social sciences. And, you know, it took evolution to work out that that really wasn't helpful, that if you want to galvanize around the protection of nature, you need all sciences on the table, you need all knowledge systems. The other shift, major shift during the time that I observed was that move away from a fortress approach to conservation of people, of nature without people, to something that's more inclusive, participatory conservation. And also recognition that in many parts of the world, protected areas were established at the cost of removing removing Indigenous peoples from their traditional territories, and that too often protected areas are governed in the absence of a system of shared objectives, values, and principles. And at the 5th World Parks Congress, a new paradigm for protected areas was set, and following from that, a new governance category within the protected areas framework was established, and that's the IPCCAs, or Indigenous Peoples and Community Conserved Protected Areas. Having seen the success of the Red List of endangered species, the people who are behind the red List of endangered species helped pull together with a new group of scientists to look at developing a Red List of ecosystems. And I think the shift came from the same awareness that Travis talked about yesterday in terms of setting up this new bioprotection core and recognizing the need to shift from a purely species-centered approach to looking instead at ecosystems. So now there is a red list of ecosystems, but I guess they acknowledge that continuous negative messages of plotting the decline of species isn't how you mobilize people to get excited about conservation. And so a shift to more positive messaging, this notion of love, not loss, and being able to actually show positive change. So a green list of ecosystems was established alongside the red list. Acknowledging the vital role that Indigenous peoples play and how central Indigenous knowledge and sciences are to a lot of IUCN's work and conservation work in general. For the first time since IUCN was established in 1948, a new membership category was put in place, that's Indigenous Peoples Organisations, which means that IUCN will now be a member-based organisation of governments, NGOs and IPOs, Indigenous Peoples organisations. And that actually took my full 16 years on council to make that happen, to push it through. And then this notion of knowledge baskets, if I don't have the time to expand on it, but if you were to Google IUCN knowledge baskets, it will take you to a page where you will see right at the beginning the story of Tāne ascending the heavens to retrieve the 3 baskets of knowledge. And I brought this notion into IUCN to sort of shift from thinking of knowledge as a product, so they have knowledge products, and something to be commoditized, to more of a communal approach, of which a basket sort of resonates with people all around the world. And the main points that I want to make in these next few slides is that the same shift that I've referred to as happening within IUCN has been happening across a number of international processes. The global community has largely come to a convergence of recognizing the failure of unfettered capitalism and globalization and the devastating impact this value system has had on biodiversity and the state of the environment, suggesting that the world needs not just targets, but a whole new value system. And that of the targets that have been set through different processes, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, Aichi biodiversity targets, the Paris Climate Agreement, we're simply not meeting these targets. The Elizabeth Marema, the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, made this statement recently that we failed the Aichi biodiversity targets because we assumed that implementation was the role of governments. She said we missed Indigenous peoples, local communities, youth, women. We missed the private sector, finance, business, and industry. And I was interested to hear the speaker before me because the private sector has an incredibly important role to play in conservation as we move away from a government-dominated system to a more inclusive system where everyone who is able to help and wants to help has a place at the table. But I think of the many international processes I've been directly involved with, IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, has, to my mind, really pushed the boundaries in terms of working towards recognition that the values and assumptions that sit behind this aging conservation system we're working with are but one approach of multiple options. And IPBES work in conceptualizing diverse values and valuations of nature is quite groundbreaking, and Indigenous and local knowledge is firmly anchored in all streams of its work. So the recently published global assessment on biodiversity made clear that biodiversity is on the decline in every country in the world, including here, and that the scale of decline has accelerated in the past 50 years, in other words, during our lifetimes and through our decisions and actions and inactions. The assessment identified drivers of biodiversity decline, but it also noted that nature is generally declining less rapidly in Indigenous peoples' land than in other lands, but is nevertheless declining, as is the knowledge of how to manage it. They made the observation that community-based conservation institutions and local governance regimes have often been effective, and at times even more effective than formally established protected areas in preventing habitat loss. So IPBES is currently happening now. Virtually, this has required me to log in from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. every day. I've been participating in plenary sessions since 2011 as part of the ISN delegation. And the hot topic of discussion right now is the difference between ecosystem services, nature's contributions to people, and nature-based solutions. So there's all these terms that have been kind of thought up in the past few years, and really interesting discussions about what they mean. I've taken you through a really quick review of some of the international work, but what I'd like to do now is to bring that all back here to Aotearoa. So with this background of knowledge of global landscape, I actually jumped at the opportunity to apply lessons learned to a review of New Zealand's conservation policies. I was nominated by Te Tira Whakamātaki, of which Nick Waipara, Amanda Black, and Melanie Shadbolt were the creators of Te Tira Whakamātaki. And the ODG, which is what I'll call it now, the Options Development Group, was tasked with undertaking a partial review of DOC's conservation general policy and the general policy on national parks to better reflect the principles of the Treaty Waitangi. Not knowing what a partial review was, we opted for a full review, and noting that policies are designed to give effect to legislation, we also reviewed the legislation. The current legislation is incredibly outdated, some going back to 1953, the Wildlife Act, and conservation simply isn't working here at the scale that is needed. Our statistics make that abundantly clear, and our indigenous flora and fauna in particularly is declining at an unprecedented rate, and much of that is happening within the DOC estate. So DOC's performance as a treaty partner has been heavily criticised by Hapu Iwi, but it's also found to be negligent by the courts, particularly relating to the Ngāi Tai Tamaki case. And that sat behind, I guess, the DG's decision to proceed with this review. So the Options Development Group made a series of recommendations covering legislation, policies and practices. Some require major reset of the conservation system. Other recommendations can be implemented immediately as they are about the attitudes, values and behaviours of DOC staff. So we loosely group the recommendations into these 7 areas. And what the ODG is recommending comes from a vision for a less Crown-centred, dominated and controlled conservation system to a Te Tiriti partnership model where Indigenous flora and fauna, Papatuanuku, are thriving. And what we've recommended is a wide review of conservation legislation to give effect to treaty principles, to reframe the definition and purpose of conservation to ensure it is fit for purpose for Aotearoa. The current definition could have been exported from North America. Also looking at centering tikanga and mātauranga within the conservation system. We're asking for a full review of conservation governance and management systems to better reflect treaty partnership at all levels. And this includes enabling devolution of powers to meaningfully recognise the role of tino rangatiratanga. And all of this, of course, can only happen with resourcing. So just breaking it down in a little bit more detail, in terms of legal reform, there are actually over 20 acts listed in Schedule 1 of the Conservation Act. So we're recommending a review of all of those acts. We're looking for a new definition and a new of conservation, and for the Conservation Act to be written as an act about conservation rather than the way that it's currently written, which is an act about transactions of regulating access of people to different aspects of the dog estate. As I've said, we want to see some key Maori concepts included in legislation and included in the policies. I want to see a reform of the Crown ownership model, public conservation lands, with the aim of, in some cases, returning lands back to iwi, not all lands, but some, and we're also reviewing the classifications of those lands. The big one is around repealing the Wildlife Act of 1953, which currently gives to the Crown full ownership of wildlife. And the way the Act is written, that also means that for, say, traditional weavers who use feathers from Indigenous birds, under the Act, the way it is written, the Crown theoretically owns those products of the weavers. So we're saying get rid of the Act, and in fact having ownership is really not the best way of encouraging people to come to the table to talk about how to protect. If you get rid of ownership in general and talk about shared visions and objectives, we think it will be a much more productive way forward. This will require reviewing and reforming all conservation entities, including the New Zealand Conservation Authority, conservation boards, and other statutory bodies to better reflect the treaty partnership and to devolve decision-making powers to tangata whenua. We're also suggesting that all of these things must be done as a package, not just picking off one or two things. And we're currently going around the country. We have over 40 hui with hapu iwi, as well as with the conservation boards, where we are sharing the recommendations and getting feedback. I just want to summarise, and by summarising by saying, you know, that conservation as we are doing it now isn't working. It's not working in Aotearoa. It's not working in any other part of the world where this type of conservation is the major paradigm. And that at the same time, the scale of problems and threats to biodiversity is increasing. And that there is a recognition that we need a radical change. People will often speak of it, and politicians will speak of needing radical change, but they're actually reluctant to go to that next step of implementing a radical change. So the Options Development Group sort of provides a template for how the conservation system can be reformed. And we think that it's absolutely critical that it is reformed. It's critical for nature, as well as critical for the Māori Crown Treaty Partnership. And through all of this is really moving away from the nature without people value system to a full integration of people living in harmony with nature, respectful of the life force of all beings, and to design a new pathway forward on that basis. So kia ora, that's my talk. Happy to answer any queries that you might have, and I hope that some of what I said is of interest and relevance to you. Kia ora.